So my name's Julia Zay, and I'm art and media faculty here at Evergreen. And welcome to the Winter Quarter 2019 Art Lecture Series. I am, yeah, exactly. Save your applause till the end, please. I might be a new face to some of you. Our intrepid leader, Shah Osha, who leads the Art Lecture Series, is on a very well-earned sabbatical these next 2 quarters. And so I'm filling in for Shah in this capacity for this quarter. And someone else will be up here in the spring doing this. But I just want to find out how many people here have never been to an Evergreen art lecture. Oh, okay. This is maybe like a third or something like that. Okay. So welcome. I want to, for the newcomers, I want to just give you a little sense of what it is we're doing here. And for those who are coming back for more, just a little reminder. And we're going to try something a bit different this quarter. And so I want to introduce that to everybody. So this is the Evergreen Art Lecture Series. It's been going on for, I think, maybe 7, 8 years, something like that. And we are very lucky to have every other week or so an artist or a scholar who works on or writes about artists come and speak to us about their work and what they're out doing in the world. And it's so vital for us to be able to encounter and experience the work that people are doing in the world once they have left the cocoons of the beautiful space of school, which we're all very lucky to be in right now. And it gets harder to do what we get to do here when you have to make it happen out in the world. And so one of the things that is so wonderful is that we get to see the way that people have made their lives, built their lives around their creative practice through this series. So we have a roster for winter. I just wanted to quickly introduce and let you know today we have Markel Uriu, visual artist. Next week, week 4, we'll be in here and we'll be meeting Vivian Hua, who's the executive director of the Northwest Film Forum in Seattle. And she's also a filmmaker and a writer. Week 6, we have Andrew Cutrofello, who's a scholar in contemporary continental philosophy and in particular writes on poetry. Week 8, we have Rosa Clemente, who's an Afro-Puerto Rican journalist and scholar activist. That will be in Lecture Hall 1, just a heads up. And then week 9, we have an evening event, and the location is still in process. And this is an incredible screening of women in Latin American experimental animation that's hosted by Lena Aguirre, who is a scholar of women's Latin American experimental animation. Those will all be on Wednesdays, and just that one will be in the evening on Wednesday. I want to just direct you towards the website for the Artist Lecture Series if you don't know about it. It's blogs.evergreen.edu/Artist Lecture Series. And what's wonderful about this is not only can you get links to everybody that you're going to be hearing from, so you can learn more about them before and after, but you also can go to the video gallery. We have an archive of all of the art lectures going back many years. And this in itself is an incredible curriculum. You could build yourself an entire ILC or program around these lectures. So I really encourage you to go here. They're all on YouTube. And to go back and use these as resources as you're studying. Put it on when you're, I don't know, doing something else and just listen to somebody talk about their practice. But it's a really wonderful resource that we have. So here we are today with Markel's. This is Markel's bio, and every week we will get information about the next artists coming up. What am I going to say? Okay, last point. So remember that this is a classroom space, and lots of people come here as part of their program. And so as a classroom space, we kind of start at a particular time, and we end at a particular time, so this goes from 11:30 to 1. And it's important that you are here for the entire duration. So usually what happens is the artist will speak for 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll shift into a discussion and a Q&A session. And it's important that people stick around and treat this as an entire class session. And to stay until 1. This is as important as the artist talk is the discussion we get to have. It's a real privilege to be able to spend time with someone and have them be really open to conversing and discussing with us. So if you do need to use, get up and slip out to use the bathroom or something like that, just remember that you can, the bathrooms are down here on either side, but I would recommend, you could slip out that side or you could kind of go out the back and go around. Just kind of enter and leave quietly. The other thing we're going to try this quarter that we haven't done before is kind of in the spirit of remembering that this is a classroom environment, a learning environment. After the speaker is done speaking, and remember that you're here with your notebooks open, so you're taking notes. This is great. We'll take about 5 minutes or so to let the speaker just kind of have a rest, get some water, and for you to just sit and let things digest. You can just sit and close your eyes. It's a lot to take in. Or you might go back through your notes and you might kind of start to see, okay, I want to formulate a question and I'm not quite sure what this question is. Let yourself have that time to kind of go back through your notes and circle things and formulate questions. These lectures are always filled with amazing questions and comments from all of you. So that will continue to happen. But we're going to try to kind of introduce a little pause to allow just a different rhythm to the lecture. So I want to now introduce, you have to tell me who's introducing Markel. Okay, got it. I'm going to introduce Julia Hynexius, another Julia who's an art faculty, who is going to introduce the student who's going to introduce Markel. Thank you.
Instead of it being turtles all the way down, it's Julia's all the way down. It's my very great pleasure to do a pre-introduction of Markel Uriu. Markel and I had at least on my part, the pleasure of belonging to the Soil Artist-Run Gallery in Seattle together for, I think we overlapped by about 2 years or something in an artist-run gallery. And you learn things when you're in a community of people that are trying to make decisions who are also artists. You learn things about each other. And I always found that Markel has a very gracious way of sort of like bringing in lots of maybe disparate or argumentative concepts that are in the room and kind of stitching them together in ways much like her art. I also just wanted to say that I'm especially appreciative of this lecture this quarter because I'm teaching in a program where we're discussing nature and the use of natural themes in art. And I find that listening to Markel talk about her work centers me back in the realization that the incorporation of art and nature is not strictly about beauty, that it's not a neutral discussion, and that non-neutrality makes it incredibly interesting. So I am going to invite up for the more formal introduction, Sophie McCallum-Spolaris. Come on down.
Hi, I'm Sophie, and I have the honor of introducing Markel Uriu. Markel is an interdisciplinary artist whose recent work centers invasive species, their ecological impacts, and their roots in colonialism and globalization. She manifests these concepts through ephemeral botanical narratives and two-dimensional work. The images I can't get out of my mind since first interacting and seeing her work is of these very beautiful and intricate hand-sewn blankets made of leaves. I was struck by her intimacy with natural materials and her approach to a very ritualistic making. Her choice of materials and process is very labor-intensive and feels inseparably connected to her themes. There is something about the practice of sewing in her work that that feels very close to the chest, that feels very connected to the ways we work with our hands to construct and engage in survival and resilience. And there's a complexity in her work that I've been asking questions about in my own, and the way that she, as I've been engaging with her work, I've been curious about the ways that she deals with intersecting ideas that is non-restrictive but expansive and invites you into indulging in the layers of her work. Her masterful weaving of interconnected concepts, meditative processes, and earthly materials create a visual narrative that tugs on me to be present in my experience with her work and to observe my hesitations around and just in the wake of complexity. And Markel is based in Seattle and received her BA from Whitman College in 2011. She most recently was the 2018 Amazon Artist in Residence and the 2016-2017 Art Bridge Fellow at Pratt Fine Arts Center. She is a member of the Lion's Mane Art Collective for Queer and Trans Artists in Seattle and Soil Gallery in Seattle, and has shown throughout the United States. Her next upcoming show is Object Lesson this coming March at the Hadreen Gallery at Seattle University. So thank you, and join me in welcoming Markel Uriu.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, I really first I want to thank just Evergreen State College for having me, Julia and Shaw for organizing and inviting me, and to thank all of you for coming. It's really wonderful to see that people are interested in what I have to say. So yeah, as mentioned before, I'm an interdisciplinary artist and I'm based in Seattle. In making art, I should put my PowerPoint up. Just a second. There we go. Okay. So in making art, I've found myself consistently exploring a lot of the same overarching concepts, though they manifest in a lot of different forms. Time, impermanence, and liminal space are always on my mind. I'm interested in rituals and routines, and often use repetitive arrangements to create a visual rhythm that mirrors cyclical actions required to live: heartbeats, breath, blood flow. These accumulations are meant to create a space to reflect on acts of emotional endurance and the fragility of what we build. So this slide is a picture of my studio from back in 2013. I was doing a residency in upstate New York at the Wasaic Project. I use a lot of organic materials in my work. Clearly, at this point, I was a little obsessed with moss. I'd go for hikes. Since it's upstate New York, there was a lot of forest around. I'd collect moss sort of in the surrounding area. And I eventually stitched this together into a pelt, which you can kind of see the shape of on the floor. And then I wore it in the woods, but I'm actually not going to show you guys pictures of any of that because it's much older work. So I believe that my background really informs my way of making. I grew up in an arts family in New Jersey, with my mother being an art teacher and an artist, and my dad owning a decorative painting company. I was surrounded by art supplies as a result, and I've been drawing since I was a child. So here's me with one of my early works, Mr. Hot Dog. I drew animals like pretty obsessively, and like to the point where my parents bought me animal anatomy books, basically because they were like, wow, she really likes this. And from there I started copying animals just until I learned the forms. And I've pretty much taken that skill with me, and to this day still make a lot of work with animals and involving nature. So I'm also half Japanese and half Irish American, and having grown up with a mixed race identity, it's informed my preoccupation with liminal space. I feel pretty drawn to blurry lines and ideas revolving around a lack of stasis, and I think that's maybe partially why I really want to explore or integrate a lot of ideas into single pieces. So I really started to learn to paint from my father, working for him as a teenager, and doing hand-painted finishes and wallpapers and sample work for high-end houses. Working on these projects actually, I think, primed me for installations, since a lot of it is, large-scale planning, really like working with people to make a room from like start to finish. Oftentimes it's like working with designers and things like that. So some of the aesthetics I was exposed to through this company also have stuck with me and informed my work, I think in more subtle ways. But I often think of my use of flora, fauna, and beauty as related to my early exposure to the decorative arts. So in undergraduate, I'm going to share things I did in undergrad. In undergrad, I began integrating sculpture and installation into my work, and I began to make process-oriented pieces with organic materials and plants. I really loved using things that shifted beyond my control. For me, there was an element of letting go in this process and really exploring the concept of investing a lot into something that's inevitably going to fall apart. I enjoyed setting up conditions within which I could passively watch the materials take on their own life and death. There was an interesting tension between my own exertion of control alongside the clear limitations of control I had with each piece. So this piece is Untitled. I made it in 2011. It's made from plexiglass, grass seed, and soil. I kind of lovingly refer to it as my plexiglass series, but that's definitely not the real title. And I documented its growth sort of from start to its death. So initial germination, sort of the full-blown growth, the beginnings of death, and then its final form. So this is just a sampling of the full thing. I scanned it pretty much every day. So I continued my exploration with organic materials and began to make work that revolved around accumulations as well, sort of post-college. One of the first projects I did in this vein was Blanket in 2013. I took a rhododendron bush and made a blanket out of the leaves. At the time, I was living in Maine on a farm, and I would get up while it was still dark and stitch the blanket until the sun rose. I'd then go to work, run, eat, and then eat a quick dinner, and then go back and stitch the blanket until the sun set. I repeated this process until the bush was bare. Upon finishing, I slept underneath the blanket. I filmed the entire process, resulting in a really long video that I'm also not going to show you because it's really long. But when it's sped up, it shows the fluctuations from night to day and day to night. So here's a detail. It was a lot of stitching. And then here's just some stills from my studio at the time, and sort of the beginning, the middle. This is one of the mornings after the sun rose, and then the end. So, Garden is a piece I made for a show called Intimately Unseen at Soil Gallery in Seattle, Washington in 2016. I constructed a garden bed in my backyard and outfitted a section of it with like a plexiglass bottom. And then I laid down sheets of paper on top of the plexiglass and piled soil on top of it. I then let it grow for 3 months. For the duration of the 3 months, I made portraits of the garden as it grew, so drawings and paintings pretty much every day. And then at the end of the 3 months, I mounted it onto an archway, and under which people could view the root prints that were made in the paper through the plexiglass. So the portraits I made were shown alongside the archway, as you can see. To me, the root prints were sort of a primary source of the garden. So it was sort of telling its own narrative in sort of embedding itself into the paper. In a sort of poetic sense, the paper actually deteriorated completely, so the primary source was lost. And then my drawings sort of served as a secondary narrative and as sort of a observational, like from the outside. But the true narrative to me like really lays in the root systems below. So here's one of the paintings I made, just one of the portraits, and then underneath you can kind of see the roots growing. So Veil was an ongoing process piece. Every fall I gathered Lunaria plants from patches that I found just throughout Seattle and stitched them together over the course for the rest of the year. I repeated this process for 2 years, so actually the dark part in the center is 1 year, and then the lighter part is the second year. I gilded certain elements in it just to kind of give it some value, like highlight or add a value to it. When I hang the piece, I place soil underneath it. Because it's a curtain made from seeds, while I hang it, oftentimes like seeds will actually fall and then sprout over the duration of the show, when I show it. The veil was sort of a new ritual for me and served as a marker of time and a means to contemplate patterns of life and death. At the time, I was also researching Zen Buddhism and contemplating the concepts and ideas within its philosophy, examining the parallels between the philosophical ideas sort of embedded in Zen and the ephemeral exercises I was creating with my own work. I approached this piece as an act of meditation. So here's a detail in the gilded elements. So I continued in the same vein with gold. I maybe then got a little too obsessed with gold, but Detritus was an installation I made at Method Gallery in Seattle in 2017. I collected and gilded nearly 2,000 leaves by hand and gilded them over the course of 6 months. I used a combination of real and fake gold. During the duration of the show, I invited viewers to do pretty much whatever they wanted in the space. I also sold the leaves for $60 a leaf, regardless of the material I gilded them with. So there was really no distinction between the I guess, more valuable gold and then the imitation. So kind of letting people do whatever they want in a space, it was actually pretty interesting to see how people reacted. Some people just went wild and were just like, yeah, and like ran in and like started rolling around in the leaves. People were like in the corner like tearing them up. Like, yeah, it was like pretty wild. And then other people would like read the statement and be like, oh my God, it's made out of gold and you gilded this by hand. And then they'd like leave the room and they'd refuse to be in the room because they were like too afraid to hurt or damage anything. So really just like the whole range of reactions. But to me, this particular piece was sort of thinking about concepts of value in relationship to labor and also ephemera, because these leaves are real leaves. So there is, they're pretty fragile and they will deteriorate eventually. Yeah, so here's after. And then here's a detail shot of the leaves. So in addition to my installation and sculpture practice, I also make drawings. These particular pieces explore similar ideas, sort of similar overarching ideas of cycles and repetition. So this is actually a triptych. Here's the first. It's titled Viscera, for obvious reasons. It's sort of meant to depict a painful cycle of emotional processing. So this is the release. This is the consumption. And this is sort of the resting post-consumption. So I feel like, just inherently a lot of the art I make sort of explores the complex identity I have, but I usually shy away from sort of explicit pieces about my personal history. This one is one of the few pieces I've made that's directly autobiographical. I made it for a show called From Which We Rise, curated by Satpreet Kalan at the Alice Gallery in Seattle in 2017. Using origami paper that I'd saved from childhood and handmade paper from my mother, who makes it for her own work, I hand-stitched it all together to create a vestment. It was stitched together in the style of Boro fabrics, a now defunct patching technique in Japan, done predominantly by peasant farmers, in which clothing was visibly patched whenever it was repaired. This resulted in pieces of clothing completely made of the patchwork. Because the clothing was passed down through generations, the fabric often served as a visual manifestation of generations of the family. The vestment was a tribute to my recently deceased grandmother, Reverend Markel Uriu, the first Japanese woman minister in the Methodist Church. It was a reflection of the strength of the matriarchs in my family and their influence over our family values. It was shown alongside a paper piece made by my mother, Beverly O'Mara, and a wooden bird that was carved by my grandmother while she was interned in Poston, Arizona during World War II, alongside hundreds of thousands of other Japanese Americans. So here's just the vestment itself, and then here's the three pieces together. My mother's paper piece is in the center, and the carved bird is top left, that little tiny thing. So these are some illustrations I made of a Japanese fairy tale while I was researching Zen Buddhism and its spread to Japan. The story is about the fox spirit, or the kitsune, and how it got its name. In the story, a man looks for a wife and finds a woman who is also looking for a husband. They marry and have a child. Eventually, she's outed as a fox spirit and runs off into the woods. The man, distraught, asks her to come and sleep with him every night, and she faithfully does so. One translation of kitsune is come and sleep, which is where the name supposedly comes from. I was drawn to the fox's devotion to the life she built in her human form and the ritual she established in spite of her inability to fully return to that life. So the title of these pieces are Rustling Skirts and Come and Sleep, and they were drawn in 2017. Okay, so this is my current studio in Seattle, in Georgetown. I'm working on a show right now, so it's getting messy. Eventually it'll be messier, because that's what happens when I'm preparing for a show. But I think it looks pretty good right now. So since late 2017, I've been thinking about the context behind a lot of the materials I've used, specifically the plants that I've been finding and collecting for the past decade. I quickly realized many were considered non-native or invasive upon doing just some initial research. I'm someone who's lived predominantly in urban landscapes, so generally have found and foraged my materials within cities. Cities drastically alter the landscape, creating new conditions for new species to thrive. While these new conditions favor some native organisms, it also sets the stage for many non-native species to thrive as well. In addition, because we're often cultivating the green parts of cities ourselves, and many garden plants are non-native, we're constantly introducing non-native species to the environment. So for example, like the plants I collected for Vale were definitely a garden plant that escaped and established itself along the roadsides and empty plots where I found them, because they were definitely in like these very strange, obscure places. Like I'd be driving down 99 and then like be like, there's the money plant, I gotta pull over. Which, yeah, it's probably a little strange to see someone like pulling up what looks kind of like weeds along the side of the road. So because I was sort of curious about, I wanted to kind of learn more about, I guess, the ecology behind invasive species, I contacted a biologist, or a conservation biologist at the University of Washington, who began providing me with resources to read about invasive species. This kind of opened a huge rabbit hole that I've just been going down ever since. So here's a sampling of the books that I currently either have read or am reading. Yeah. So I've always been an avid reader, and I've generally supplemented a lot of my work with reading. It's inspired and informed a lot of the things I've done, but this is the first time I'm really, I think, integrating it into my practice in such a pointed way. So I see invasive species as a reflection of us because they travel with us. Their movements and establishments often reflect human patterns of migration, globalization, and colonialism. I believe our subsequent attitudes towards them can also serve as a reflection of our overarching and evolving cultural values. So after reading some initial books, I at first began making work that focused on narratives embedded in individual species. I began by looking specifically at organisms in the Pacific Northwest, which range from hyperlocal to globally distributed species. So Himalayan blackberry was one of the first plants that caught my eye. If you've ever seen a large thicket of blackberries covering a median or a bramble growing out of concrete, out of like a crack in concrete, it's probably Himalayan blackberry. It dominates the landscape in the Pacific Northwest. A non-native species, it established itself in the area approximately 150 years ago. Originally from Armenia, it was distributed as a food source by the botanist and plant breeder Luther Burbank, who is celebrated for breeding a variety of well-known plants widely used today. The russet potato and the Shasta daisy are two examples. If you've ever eaten a McDonald's French fry, you've eaten a potato that was bred by Burbank. So Burbank eventually turned his sights to the breeding of humans, unfortunately, and was an early advocate for the American eugenics movement, writing the essay, The Training of the Human Plant. The eugenics movement in America was rooted in the biological determinist ideas of Sir Francis Galton. It was endorsed and supported by many in the academic community in the early 1900s and received financial support from many corporations at the time to fund projects and experiments like sterilization projects and things like that. Pretty horrible. It eventually went on to influence the ideas of Hitler and Nazi Germany. So once established, incredibly successful invasive species like the Himalayan blackberry are incredibly hard to get rid of. Billions of dollars a year goes into attempts to control and eradicate problematic non-native species, and often with no tangible results. To me, this is like ideas that establish themselves. Once they take hold, it's hard to erase them completely. This installation is titled Luther Burbank's Lovers. I bound the plants while they were still living. I wanted to simultaneously hold and constrain their growth in order to grapple with their complex history. Once a problematic species establishes itself, how does one address it if reversal or complete removal isn't possible? So Scotch broom exists on the entirety of the west coast of the United States. In the late spring and early summer, if you've seen a bush with its bright, or you've probably seen the bush with its bright yellow flowers on the hills along I-5. It's been widely cultivated as an ornamental plant and bears significance in many European cultures. The Gaelic name means the plant that Belus favored, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing Belus right. It might be Belu. Belus being a sun god. It appears widespread in Scottish literature. It's appeared on the emblems of various kings from England and France. It was also used for medical reasons, as a diuretic, as a blood staunch, as a cathartic. European immigrants in Vancouver very purposefully cultivated and spread Scotch broom as a reminder of their homeland. As early as 1827, the seeds were available to purchase in gardening catalogs. Now considered an invasive species, those who introduced the plant considered it a beautification of the landscape, which is pretty wild to me since the Pacific Northwest is probably one of the most beautiful landscapes I've ever seen. Yeah, this purposeful spread can be seen as an act of colonizing the landscape itself. It serves as a means to embed one's own culture into the ecosystem. The title of this piece is Crowned with Gold and is in reference to a description used by the writer Herbert Cuthbert when describing the hills in the Vancouver area in 1907. So like the blackberry, also wrapped the Scotch broom shrub in string while it was still alive. I arranged the scans of the plant in bloom behind it, mimicking its reproduction and eventual spread beyond our own cultivation. So I also began looking at species that are considered invasive on a global scale. The European rabbit has established itself on every continent besides Antarctica. It's considered a pest in most places. It's the only widely domesticated species of rabbit and has been spread by humans who've historically used them as a resource for food, skins, and companionship. One of the first recorded instances of an invasive problematic species was in the 1st century BC, when the Romans came and colonized the Balearic Islands, bringing rabbits who multiplied and caused a near famine, consuming all the agriculture on the island, and even collapsing the houses with their burrows. The Romans eventually had to send troops back to the islands to exterminate the rabbits with the help of ferrets. They also spread the European rabbit to other parts of the continent, including places like England. This piece is titled Famine, in parentheses, Roman Conquest, and is made from rabbit skins and scans of rabbit skins. So while rabbits are globally plentiful, they're also declining in population in their native region of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. This, in turn, is affecting local predators who rely on the rabbits for food. They've declined drastically enough that they've recently been classified as vulnerable or near threatened in Spain and Iberia. This piece, entitled O Caniculus Dominion and O Caniculus Decline, or Rictolagus caniculus being their scientific name, is in response to the rabbit's simultaneous rise and fall, and the metaphorical mirroring of the rise and fall of the colonial empires that spread them. I also think of this piece as just a rabbit mountain, 2 rabbit mountains. But yeah, there's scans and rabbit pelts, and then I drew these rabbits, sort of imitating scientific drawings or sort of classical style, just hyper-realistic. So during the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, as Europeans expanded their colonial empires, they encountered more and more landscapes with unfamiliar ecosystems. It became fashionable to create voluntary social groups called acclimatization societies. These societies thrived in France, England, the United States, and the many countries they colonized, including Australia and New Zealand, for example. The goal of these societies were to introduce non-native species to new regions in order to enrich the landscape and the pre-existing ecosystem. Although they were voluntary, some even had government backing. So the first acclimatization society was formed in Paris on May 10th, 1854, and quickly spread beyond. While the societies within France and England sought to bring in exotic animals to their own country, the colonies that established these societies were often seeking to enrich what they considered to be an impoverished landscape. So most of the introductions engineered were European flora and fauna. So there were, just an aside, there were other acclimatization societies besides European ones. One example is the Honolulu Majiro Club in Hawaii, which was started by Japanese immigrants and was devoted to the introduction of birds from Asia to Hawaii. But for the most part, it seems like the people doing the introducing were European or of European descent. So the New York branch of this organization was called the American Acclimatization Society. In the late 1800s, the head of the society was a man named Eugene Schieffelin, a wealthy manufacturer of pharmaceuticals. He got it into his head that it would be a great idea to introduce every bird mentioned in Shakespeare. So he did that. Most of the birds died, but starlings managed to survive. So starlings. So starlings are mentioned once by Shakespeare in a line in Henry IV, and I'm definitely going to butcher this, but here we go. Nay, I'll have a starling shall be taught to speak nothing but Mortimer, and give it him to keep his anger still in motion. So that's the line. This one line was enough for Schieffelin. So in 1890, he released 60 starlings in Central Park in New York, and they managed to survive the winter. And then he released 40 more the next year. And from those 100, a whole population of starlings were born. So over the course of 50 years, they spread across the whole of the United States, and there are now about 150 million starlings here, and in parts of Canada and Mexico. Being aggressive birds, They've been thought to have contributed to the extinctions of some local birds in various parts of the United States. So I'm currently creating a large installation for a show at Seattle University in March, as it was mentioned. So from 60 starling pelts, I'll be scanning and reproducing them until they amass into a large murmuration. So this here is sort of a smaller work serving as a mock-up that I made for it. Just kind of testing aesthetics and just meditating on this idea of all of the starlings in this country coming from 60. And then here's scans of the starling pelts that I'll be using to create the piece. So I actually scanned these at my residency at Amazon. So I think I probably scared some people because it was like in like the office, like copy center. I'd just be there with like dead birds. People would turn around and be like, "Hi, I belong here. Please don't kick me out." But yeah, anyways. So yeah, there's 60 of those, but here's just a sampling. So the single species narratives were interesting exercises in exploring and highlighting the ways in which we move organisms. I found the introductions of the early 1900s and prior to be particularly compelling in their ability to highlight the prevailing colonial attitudes of the time. At a certain point, public opinion about introducing non-native species flipped. From there, introductions and movements became more accidental in general. Trade and movements of goods became a means for accidental introductions, with organisms sneaking onto boats in the ship's ballast water, for example, or maybe within a shipment of lumber. Because of our increasingly interconnected world and economy, a new collective of globally distributed species have emerged. This is creating what ecologist Kenneth Thompson refers to as a second Pangaea, Pangaea being the supercontinent that existed until it broke apart and formed the continents we have now. So I'm collecting these new global species, scanning them and weaving them together, compiling a visual map of this emerging ecosystem. This piece is titled Colonial Migrations and was the first piece I did experimenting with weaving scans together. I kind of consider it a transitional piece between the one-off narratives and the global ones, the emerging global ones. So here's my first larger weaving. So these weavings serve as a parallel to the globalizing world, a physical manifestation that to me mirrors some of the ways we are connecting digitally. In mapping these species, I'm examining this phenomenon and the unintentional side effects of technological advancements, trade, and commerce. The landscape mirrors us, manifesting similarly to digital exchange. So the species included in this particular weaving are common starling, house cat, European rabbit, Japanese knotweed, zebra mussel, and last but not least, humans. So the human element, I think, is actually the most important addition to these global weavings, in spite of the ecological damage that a lot of these specific species have done, and the dark histories they're associated with were the actual carriers, and the dark histories are ours. A lot of the species that are problematic are also ones that came here because we wanted them here, and then when they became inconvenient or problematic to us, we decided we didn't want them anymore. So to me, like this sort of emerging ecosystem are actually an indicator of how integrated we actually are in the ecosystem, so much that we are unintentionally creating connecting the continents with an overarching ecosystem. So alongside these weavings, I'm also showcasing the individual species themselves, chopping them to create metaphorical dissections, and then mounting them in shadow boxes. So here's just a sampling of a few. This one's European rabbit dissected. Starlings again. They also move when you like walk past them because they're just hanging on insect pins. So I've also been drawing species in the style of scientific illustrations, cutting them up and dissecting those ones as well. I don't know if you've ever like worked on something for a really long time and then purposefully cut it up, but it's like kind of stressful. But I did it, and I think it turned out fine, so here's the result. So this particular fish is a common carp, and it's one of the most introduced fish in the world, and another global species. Like the rabbit, it was distributed throughout Europe by the Romans and is considered vulnerable to extinction in its native region. Like starlings, it's thought to have been brought to certain places like Australia and established with the help of an acclimatization society. In the United States, it was distributed as a food source. Fish stocking here is actually really common and still a practice that still kind of goes on today with a lot of sport fish. So trout in particular are pretty big, rainbow trout. So at this point, though, like carp isn't particularly eaten, so it's considered a pest in a lot of parts of the country. It's the third most farmed fish in the world, with China producing 70% of its production. At the time I was making this piece, I just received a grouping of articles from the conservation biologists that explored some of the current philosophical and moral arguments conservation biologists are having around the issue of invasive species. One biologist advocated for the demilitarization of the language surrounding invasive species, noting that commonly used words like eradication, bombardment, detonations, and battle are all borrowed from military language, which in turn influences public opinion and misinforms people about the more nuanced realities in invasive biology and ecosystems. Another article laments the increasing homogenized globalized landscape, noting that it's potentially bad for distinctive human cultures, whose traditions are often tied to their landscape, as well as bad for business, as tourism makes up 10% of the world's economy. They note that people may be less inclined to visit new landscapes if the landscape has little variation from their own. Another article questions if eating invasive species to manage problematic populations is actually a viable option, because this is a thing, there are programs that do that. So in drawing the carp, I wanted to symbolically replicate the act of observing and then dissecting my own process and result. This is my belly button. Here's what the human scan looked like before I chopped it and weaved it into the piece. So yeah, I lay on a scanner and scan my belly button. And then, this was like something I did at home. My roommate came home and was like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "Don't worry about it. It's for art." But in Rambunctious Gardens, author Emma Harris advocates for a more conscientious approach to planning our spaces, pointing out that 75% of the world's ice-free land is built upon by people for cities, agriculture, towns, etc., with only 22% showing no sign of human occupation. She outlines the history of conservation and its philosophical basis on Western ideas of nature as a separate entity from man. She points out the false dichotomy of pre-human land versus tainted or disturbed land, aka not nature, a comparison that generally doesn't take into account the people who lived on and managed and most definitely affected the landscape prior to European colonization. It's undeniable that the ecosystems in untouched forests have been shaped by people, whether it's through burning practices, controlling of predator and prey populations, or logging practices that favor certain trees, reshaping which ones actually continue to grow and thrive and mature. These preconceived ideas of nature and not nature affect our attitudes towards invasive species as well. The reality of invasion biology is more complicated than just invasive species equals bad, or that they spoil untouched or an already balanced ecosystem. Shifting conditions will favor certain species, whether they are native or non-native. Some native species also become problematic in this context. Most invasive species aren't even studied because we haven't even noticed their establishment, or they're not problematic in any obvious way. And they're actually just adding to the local biodiversity. It's estimated that about 10% of introduced species actually establish themselves, and 10% of those species actually go on to become pests. Most non-native species that establish themselves aren't noticed. Ecosystems are constantly changing with or without our influence. In addition, as invasion biologists have studied ecosystems, they have found indicators that while particular problematic invasive plants initially dominate, in general, the organisms that were there prior adjust and create new defenses over the course of 30 or 40 years. Because ecosystems evolve, non-native species generally integrate into the ecosystem, with the exception of a few very problematic species. Because of this, completely removing non-native species that have established themselves sometimes creates new disruptions to the ecosystem because it is acclimated to these new organisms. So there's actually very few solid studies indicating that invasive species are in fact the main cause of extinctions, with some exceptions. So island ecosystems, for example, are incredibly fragile, and there's certain species like the brown tree snake in Guam that are like really, really wreaking havoc, but often it's more complicated and once again can be traced to humans. Invasive species are actually sometimes the scapegoat. So salt cedar or tamarisk is a really good example of this. It's an invasive shrub in the Southwest. It's thought to take over riverbank. It was thought to take over riverbanks, displacing native cottonwoods and willows. In the 1800s, it was favored by many for its drought and salt tolerance, and is enjoyed by gardeners to this day for its wispy flowers. By 1900, it was growing in the wild. A series of studies in the 1930s indicated that tamarisk consumed and wasted more water than many of the native plants, a strain on an already water-scarce ecosystem. In addition, it was also thought to contribute to salinating the soil, and many of the rivers dominated by tamarisk were found to be saltier than the ones that were not. More recent studies indicate that, in fact, tamarisk may be just as economical when it comes to water consumption, its removal on riverbanks having no effect on the water levels. In fact, the reduced water levels and rising salinity on riverbanks may actually be due to our own actions, damming the rivers, altering fire regimes, overgrazing with cattle, and other river regulation practices, salinate the soil and lower the water table, creating conditions tamarisk thrives better in. When rivers flow freely and the water table has not been artificially lowered by us, the presence of tamarisk doesn't create salinization, and the native willows and cottonwoods stay. Finally, it's actually sometimes hard to tell what is native and what isn't, both due to the fact that organisms migrate and because it's sometimes unclear what people have brought and what has come on its own or when they came. The line of what is native and foreign is often decided just by a chosen date. On top of that, people sometimes pick and choose what they want to be native and want to be foreign. For example, in England, the European rabbit and European hare, two separate species, came at roughly the same time, but the European rabbit is considered invasive and the hare is a beloved native. So this project is really vast, and I'm in the beginning stages of exploring it, and I'm hoping in the next iteration of the project to more deeply explore the complicated realities relating to ideas of foreignness, sort of in the range of sort of the more complicated, complex issues with how invasive species integrate themselves, and then how we, as a culture, approach new species establishing themselves. Yeah, thank you. 100%. So with these weavings, one of the ones that I'd like to do is actually just a purely human weaving. I'm going to make a lot of people scan their own belly buttons and send them to me.
And again, I apologize because I wasn't here for that. So,
Yeah. So this piece includes my own belly in it. Part of what I am thinking a lot about and really want to emphasize is, I mean, I want to like sort of, I guess, deprogram in myself is the inclination to kind of separate myself from nature and the ecosystem. And I think that's something that culturally, like the dominant culture kind of does. And, you know, like reading sort of, you know, conservation, this, one of the books, like Rambunctious Gardens, like it talks about sort of the history of conservation and sort of how that came to be, tracing it back to the English Romantics, which in turn were influenced by which in turn influenced the American Romantics, who really were the ones who started to push for like the kind of conservation we have now. I'm sure you know this, um, but yeah. So sort of in having a weaving where my belly is in there, I want it to kind of be equal parts integrated into this new global landscape. Yeah. So part of it for me was actually thinking about the reproductive part. And so for me, there was like almost a womb-like quality to scan my belly button rather than something else, which maybe is not as in line with like, all of the other species, but that was given the limitations of the size of the scanner I had and the expensiveness of a very large scanner, I figured that would be the best sort of representation just to represent a human. But so part of actually what I'm thinking about with this global or this weaving of people is actually inviting people to scan whatever part they want and maybe making a weaving of that. Yeah. Yeah. That was a very bizarre experience. And I don't even know where to begin. Yeah, so I actually had a lot of conundrums even accepting that residency. But I also, as actually Julie and I were talking about this earlier, in terms of just surviving as an artist, I work multiple jobs and also have an art practice. And so to get paid to do my art, which Amazon did pay me, was an opportunity that was really hard to turn down. But the experience of actually being there, I was in a studio that was essentially a glass room. So people basically watched me make work and could come in and talk to me at any time if I had the door open. And even if I didn't have the door open, sometimes people came in. So it was also just, a strange display of like, look, an artist on display doing her thing. Isn't that exciting? And like, part of the like, I guess, reasons for even making that program was basically the idea was that in seeing people who think differently, like, and do like, creative things, it might inspire the employees to be more creative and more innovative, and therefore be more innovative in their jobs and create like basically more capital for Amazon. So I don't know, getting swept up in that was like completely bizarre and weird. Sorry, I also lost my train of thought for the question because Amazon makes my head explode a little bit whenever I think about it. But yeah, I also, I was working on the project while I was at Amazon, and I actually ended up talking to a lot of the employees about it too, because they'd basically be like, oh, it's apt that you're here at Amazon doing this project. We're kind of like that. And I'd be like, yeah, that's true. But I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Could you repeat some of your question? No, I haven't particularly thought about that angle so much. Yeah, not in this particular, not in that particular way. No, yeah. So to me, these things are Okay, so what's interesting to me about doing this project is so much of my previous work is based on sort of ideas of cycles, and this kind of tore apart some of those ideas when applied to something like an ecosystem because it is constantly evolving. But what ties that work to me to this kind of work is the element of narrative and also the changes, like basically the way that I'm mapping out changes. Like time is like the essential thing to me. And then on top of that too, like creating these sort of labor intensive things still, like it's still happening in my work, like these kinds of weavings. So that to me is kind of the overarching continuation of those projects. I have to be really organized, which I'm not that organized because I'm an artist. No, a lot of artists are really organized. There's like, yeah, but I'm not one of them. I'm like incredibly scatterbrained. But you know, for me, the way I've kind of made my way has been really through a lot of, like, because I grew up in sort of an arts area, I've stayed sort of in that realm. So I've worked a multitude of odd jobs. And then all the while, basically like the essential thing for me is being able to make time to make work. And then in that time, making sure to be disciplined enough to continue actually making that work, because it's really easy to make time, or it's not really easy, but once you make time, you still have to like go into the studio. So for me to kind of develop that, basically just accumulating skills for me has like been part of like what's allowed me to do that. So I have like very specialized skills. Most of it has to do with sort of presentation and making things look nice. So like I worked in TV and I did, sets and things like that. I worked in art department, and then, working as a decorative painter, I would, make rooms look nice and, pretty much like do what the clients were kind of asking me to do. And then currently I'm actually working for another artist who's got a commission at CTech. And, once again, it's really finding her aesthetics and making them work and look, sort of aligned with what she really wants. What's nice about a skill set like that is while it's niche, it also like means that I can move around, and a lot of the jobs that I have with it allow for kind of freedom and are project based, which has helped me just integrate it into sort of my daily life. But I mean, every artist kind of finds their own way, and I kind of feel like it's a free for all, in a lot of ways. Like, I've had some artists, like I know some artists who, like maybe like get a design degree and then will sort of on and off work for these high-paying design jobs, like work in these high-paying design jobs, and then like, quit for residencies and really section off their time to, where they're working for huge chunks of time, and then they're just having really concentrated time to like make and just create. Yeah. It's actually set to go back there someday. So that's kind of, yeah. So in that way, like a lot, the work that I take those things from, generally I see as like having a relationship to the place too. I think it depends on the piece. Yeah, I think it depends on the piece. And for me, like sometimes it's more important that they know, and sometimes it's not, that emphasis. So like something like the garden piece, I feel like it's important to understand where those, like that the piece came from my backyard. Like it's like it was about place and home, and like that place was kind of important, or that it was carried into the gallery. It didn't just like, it's not just like a singular piece in there. So for me, I think what like in a very personal sense, making that kind of work for me is centering. And it's not centering because it's easy or calms me down. It's centering partially because it makes me understand that I can like sit through things. So if these projects aren't done in a vacuum, and it's not like me just sitting in the studio, it's like my life is happening. So I've done those projects going through very hard times at certain points, and so in that sense, it makes me kind of like the thing that I personally have gotten out of those projects and that sort of process is realizing that my feelings end, like they're not forever. Hard things can end, and I can also endure them. So I guess in that personal sense, that's sort of what I get from it. Well, for this particular project, I'm kind of not giving myself a deadline to complete this work, partially because I think that there are a lot of avenues to explore, and I think I actually want to explore all of those avenues. In regards to just researching, I pretty much, like with this particular ecologist, it's like I'm not an expert on invasive species. I just am reading a lot about it, and then I'm trying to react accordingly. But like I cannot claim to be an expert in any sense. So I thought it was important if I was going to do this project, and especially if I was thinking about the context, to get someone who was. The way that process kind of worked is I contacted him, we initially met up, he gave me a few books to read, and then from there I told him what I was interested in within the context of these more general books, and then he started to send me more more pointed articles and books that he felt like applied to the things that I was gravitating towards, which, for me, a lot of it was sort of the philosophical and moral conundrums around how you address invasive species, because some are really damaging. Altering ecosystems is really intense. Because it's ever-changing, like people are kind of reeling, trying to figure out how to purposefully construct and insert themselves in the ecosystem in a way that's not going to be damaging. Yeah, so basically, like with that, like, oh no, I lost my train of thought again, damn. But yeah, basically, he kind of has let me, like, yeah, direct it. Yeah. Thank you. Yep. Kiki Smith, always. For some reason, Kiki Smith does. And I think part of it is because she's, her work just, she makes whatever she wants. Like she just makes and goes wherever she wants. And that's, and I appreciate that part of her practice. But there's also just certain images that she's made that yeah, they just stick with me. Like her animal drawings, like, and maybe partially because I draw myself and I love drawing animals, like I think that they're some of the most exquisite like animal drawings I think I've ever seen. I like, right now I'm just thinking of this fox that she drew on red paper. It's really beautiful with white ink. But yeah, so Kiki Smith is one. Andy Goldsworthy isn't my favorite artist, but I still think about him. So in that sense, he stays with me. Man. Sorry, I'm coming up with more artists like off the top of my head is hard. But I think that there's actually, it's like actually like more like movements, like so I didn't particularly like minimalists until I went to the Dia Beacon and like saw those pieces in person. And so actually like a lot of pieces from the Dia Beacon actually like stick with me. Currently, Jan Vo. I saw his show at the Guggenheim, and then from there kind of went on a rampage looking at him, because his work is so research and history based and interdisciplinary. I really like his work too. Yeah. It's interesting. It's refreshing, in a certain way. You know, yeah, it just feels. I mean, right now it feels engaging to me. I think partially because I've been doing the other kind of work for so long. It's actually kind of nice to like step away and see my practice evolve in a sort of a different way, but still related. And I don't know, like to me, the art I make, I think the process should be dictated. Like I don't feel particularly tied to any particular process. I'm just doing what interests me, and so in that way, like there's not really, like if a project seems more fitting to go back to that kind of thing, then I'll go do that. But for now, like this feels just more right for like what I'm doing and what I'm thinking about in this project. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Markel.
Thank you.